Morena, Atamaria kia tātou katoa. Aloha mai, I'm late again. Hard getting this right, 8 a.m. being on the dot, and I make me a coffee and I don't get to drink it because it goes cold by the time I'm finished reading. So I'll just wait for a few of you to join and then I'll start. Morena, Nina. Everyone, I'll turn it down. Okay, so morena. So ngā mihi o te ata. Ako Dr. Diana Kopua ho, aka Dr. Di, and I am a psychiatrist, a fellow of the Royal College, the Australian New Zealand College of Psychiatrists. And before that, I was actually a psychiatric nurse, a Māori mental health nurse. I grew up in my career, I grew up very connected to a Mataora-based mental health service in Porirua under the umbrella of Te Whare Māori, and the kaumātua there were Pico Te Rangi Arthur and Ani Sweet, and they were beautiful. They've passed away. They passed away way before their time, and it was a real blessing to have them as our korowai as we were growing up in a time where there was a real strong promotion of Māori approaches to address mental health problems. So I've come on here at 8 o'clock every morning to be able to read from this book from a psychiatrist, Diana Kopua, and she talks about a straight talking introduction to the psychiatric drugs and had the truth about how they work and how to come off them. I'm not sure I say this every morning, but for those of you who might be on psychotropic medication, so they label them antidepressants, antipsychotics, anxiety medication. This is not permission to just jump off them. They can have a significant withdrawal impact effect, and it's really important that you do that with your the team who prescribe them and work in partnership with them. However, I don't believe that many of our practitioners working in mental health services are up to date with the most recent information. And I am connected to a group, a critical psychiatry group, and Diana Kopua has a lot to do in that. We exchange information via email. Here I am saying they. I don't often contribute to it. I feel like a big learner in their presence, and I feel quite grateful for that connection as well. And so when I get this knowledge, we know that knowledge is power. We also know that mental health problems for a very long time have been considered as illnesses. Now, many of us have, if I ask you where you learned that mental health problems are illnesses, you might not be able to trace that back, because everyone in society has been affected by the language that we use when talking about emotional distress. However, when we think about illness and refer to emotional problems as an illness, then we're leaving it in the hands of the experts who use a particular language and also who haven't necessarily been getting it right. And this book will try and provide an even balanced discussion about the knowledge that we know about mental health, and some arguments and some references, if you want to look them up, about that. Now we're up to chapter 2. I've read maybe a third of chapter 2. Oh, crikey, maybe not. And we just started by explaining that the type of drugs used in psychiatry are based on an assumption that we are reversing an underlying disease process. And that disease process is very much centered around the idea that there's a chemical imbalance when we have emotional distress, severe enough to warrant the need to reach out for help. And there is no evidence of that mentioned in previous chapters. And also yesterday we started talking about how those, the theory, how it works, how the chemicals that we are referring to actually work in the body, and how we are targeting those chemicals, increasing them or decreasing them to get the required effect that we need. And so although the last paragraph, it mentioned that scientists, although they acknowledge that those theories are just that, theories, which are far from being proven, there is a widespread public perception that the biochemical origins of various psychiatric disorders have been established. So let's go. Are mental disorders caused by a chemical imbalance? No psychiatric disorder has been conclusively linked to a specific biochemical disturbance. The dopamine theory of schizophrenia and the monoamine theory of depression have been the most thoroughly researched. As far as depression is concerned, studies of serotonin and noradrenaline activity in depression produce a confusing and conflicting picture. Some studies suggest that depression is linked with a deficiency in serotonin. Some suggest it is associated with an excess of serotonin, and some find no relationship. In contrast to public information put out by psychiatric organizations and pharmaceutical companies, leading psychiatrists and researchers admit, when speaking personally, that there is no evidence to support the idea that depression is caused by a lack of serotonin or any other biochemical abnormality. One influential US psychiatrist, Ronald, I'm not sure if it's pies, it looks like pies, has even referred to the chemical imbalance theory of depression as an urban legend. You should get that going. Even the most faithful proponents of the serotonin theory of depression admit it has not been substantiated and that the evidence is unreliable. You can find that referenced in Cohen and Browning, 2015. Okay, the dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia and psychosis. Hi, morning everyone, just checking in. Hopefully the pace is okay and that you're following it. I know like yesterday was quite a bit of heavy language. I'm thinking that might be coming ahead of us too, so I'll just take a sip of my coffee. Dopamine has been the main focus of interest in schizophrenia and psychosis. I'm just letting you know that as I'm reading this, I'm almost having flashbacks to my training days and the time spent in trying to understand these theories so that I understood psychiatry. Okay, dopamine has been the main focus of interest in schizophrenia and psychosis, although other chemicals, including serotonin and glutamate, have also been proposed to have an effect from time to time. The dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia suggests that schizophrenia or psychosis is due to hyperactivity of the dopamine system. In its more sophisticated versions, it suggests that the positive symptoms of schizophrenia or the symptoms of acute psychosis, such as delusions and hallucinations, are produced by overactivity of dopamine, but that the dopamine system is not necessarily the root cause of the disorder as a whole. The dopamine theory of schizophrenia was first proposed in the 1960s when it was discovered that one of the main actions of the antipsychotic drug haloperidol is to block the dopamine activity. The idea that antipsychotics work by reducing dopamine activity is often cited as strong evidence in favor of the dopamine hypothesis in schizophrenia. So for those that weren't here yesterday, the idea is, so there's a system, and if the theory is that these symptoms of hearing voices and these strong beliefs that not many other people believe in, it's really unshiftable in you, which they refer to as delusions. And of course, hallucinations are ones where your perceptions are impacted. And so you smell things that aren't necessarily transparent, tangible in your environment. You hear things, not just voices, but sounds. You hear sound that other people around you can't hear. So this is considered a misperception, and a misperception is considered a hallucination when we are in psychiatry looking at someone who's emotionally distressed and might be hearing voices and has strong beliefs, say that people next door are spying on them, or that there are aliens in the wall, or that someone has transplanted a device in the back of your eye. And they're very distressing emotional spaces to be in, because if someone is tormented with the idea that something is in behind your eye, we in psychiatry know people who have literally pulled their eye socket out to be able to get rid of that device. And so some really horrific things have happened, and they have been termed these names, hallucinations and delusions. And hallucinations and delusions have been grouped together and been considered to represent a diagnosis of another term, schizophrenia. And our understanding in psychiatry of schizophrenia over time has changed. And so the theory behind these chemicals, dopamine, being largely responsible for these experiences that we're having, mean that we give you these drugs, and they mention haloperidol, and we give you those drugs to block, it's like to plug up the amount of dopamine that is in that space. And so if we plug it up, then we're less likely to be able to experience those misperceptions and beliefs that are causing distress for us. So that's the theory. Plug it up, block it, block the dopamine from being able to be released, and then we will improve your well-being. Just bye. Okay, so it was first proposed in the 1960s, the dopamine theory, when it was discovered that one of the main actions of haloperidol, is to block dopamine activity. And the idea of working to reduce dopamine activity is often cited as strong evidence in favor of the dopamine hypothesis theory. Drugs that block dopamine activity do indeed have profound effects on mental activity and behavior, but antipsychotics affect a range of other neurotransmitter systems as well as dopamine. So they're not targeted to just dopamine. In fact, some antipsychotics, such as clozapine, have relatively weak effects on the dopamine system in comparison with their effects on other neurotransmitters. And clozapine's effects on dopamine do not correlate with its therapeutic effects. Say that again. Wow. Clozapine's effects on dopamine do not correlate with its therapeutic effects. So the idea that dopamine is largely responsible for these experiences. What we know in psychiatry is that if we've tried lots and lots of these so-called terms, antipsychotics, that we sometimes consider it as treatment resistant. And so we then look to clozapine, which has some significant adverse reactions. And when we are looking at it, it's not actually focused on dopamine. Okay. A large quantity of other research has failed to demonstrate a relationship between dopamine and psychosis or schizophrenia, including post-mortem studies of dopamine levels in the brain and studies of the breakdown products of dopamine in urine and cerebrospinal fluid. Research on dopamine receptors shows these are increased in people diagnosed with schizophrenia. And this finding was initially thought to represent evidence to support the dopamine hypothesis. So just catching some people who might not be keeping up. There have been people who have died, and they've looked at both they've looked at the dopamine levels in the brain, and then there are studies that looked at the products of dopamine in urine and cerebrospinal fluid. And research on dopamine receptors shows that there's an increase of receptors. And so those are like the keyholes welcoming the dopamine in, that dopamine acts like a key, goes into this keyhole of receptor site that then triggers nerve activity. And when they found that with people who have been diagnosed with schizophrenia, had a large number of keyholes, a large number of receptor sites, and therefore that supports, right, that might support the idea that, yes, there's a large number of receptor sites. And in the body, if you have a whole lot of dopamine, then that will increase the number of keyholes that need to be made, receptor sites. And so it makes sense that we might think of this theory as like, aha, yes, that proves our theory. However, it is now accepted that it merely reflects the effects of the antipsychotic drug treatment that participants were taking. So one of the variables when we theorize like this is that people with schizophrenia are usually, if not always, diagnosed with schizophrenia and then prescribed medication. And what happens when you take the medication is that you increase the dopamine activity. So same theory, but not really looking at why there was an increase in dopamine. And okay, the fact that stimulant drugs such as amphetamines can provoke a psychotic state is also believed to support the dopamine hypothesis, since stimulants increase dopamine activity. However, they also affect many other neurotransmitter systems, particularly noradrenaline. And it has never been shown that the psychosis-inducing effects of stimulants are specifically attributable to the effects on dopamine. Some more recent studies indicate increased activity in the dopamine system in people experiencing an acute episode of psychosis. None of these studies adequately accounted for all the other things that are known to influence dopamine activity. However, including stress, arousal, movement, and smoking, and most of them included people who were taking or had taken antipsychotics. So there's some more variables, right? So more recent studies indicated an increased activity in the dopamine system in people experiencing an acute episode of psychosis. But none of those adequately accounted for other things that are known to influence dopamine activity. That's not clever, right? Like stress increases your dopamine activity, arousal, so dopamine, especially sexual arousal, right? So movement increases dopamine activity, and smoking increases dopamine activity. So they didn't include that, or they didn't really account for it. It's not surprising that brain chemistry is acutely distributed. Where am I? So it doesn't necessarily indicate anything about psychosis or schizophrenia specifically. Indeed, it appears that the symptoms of schizophrenia are associated with abnormalities in virtually every transmitter system that has been explored. Despite popular beliefs and the claims made by pharmaceutical companies and professional organizations, there is little evidence, therefore, to support even the most well-accepted biochemical theories about the origins of psychiatric symptoms. They remain theories or hypotheses rather than facts. It is still regularly argued that because drugs have biochemical effects and because they appear to benefit people with psychiatric symptoms, at least in some instances, the disorder must be the result of a biochemical state. That is the opposite to that produced by the drugs. Yet this argument can only be made if it is assumed that drugs act according to the disease-centered model. And that's a disease-centered model of drug action. And that is the idea, this model is the idea that these drugs act by reversing the underlying disease process or part of it. And what Joanna's saying here is that we don't know the underlying disease process or that there is one. Even if the mechanisms associated with mental health problems could be identified, however, we still cannot presume that psychiatric drugs impact on symptoms by affecting those mechanisms. There is an alternative way of understanding how drugs can exert effects on the symptoms of mental disorders. Right, so let's just check, see if anyone's got any corded or Joanna's going to talk about an alternative model next. So let's have a look. Morena, everyone. I might have caught you too late. Latoya, morena. Kia ora, Nina. Morena. Hey, kia ora, hineriata. It's getting colder, right? Morena tia ara. Kia ora, everyone. Kia ora, Oe. Morena, Oe. Hey, Dana. Kia ora, sis. Right, who else? Morena Waikura. Kia ora, everyone. Just scrolling through. Tēnā tātou. I'm just looking through. Thanks, Annie. You're very interesting, right? So, and that's why I want to share it, because it is interesting. Morena Elsie. Kia ora, down there in the Te Waipounamu. Morena Julie. Not all of your peers are up to date or on par. So many research theories, clinical trials in regards to a successful cure in 90 days as far back as the 30s, moving forward to the 50s, 60s, have been dismissed by the American Medical Association. We all know what that's about. Keep people on drugs, profit before people. Thanks, Julie. Thanks for your thoughts. Kia ora. Lovely to have you here. Kia ora from Australia. So this really impacts our Indigenous peoples hugely, because we are more likely to be considered to have mental health problems, and therefore we're more likely to be drugged up. And so if you are on medication and you are working with a psychiatrist, please, what I know is an alliance is the most important to a good outcome. And your alliance is important. And so that's about your psychiatrist or your mental health team being able to shift, not you having to work hard, but you being able to give feedback. So I hope that this is helpful and you being able to give this feedback and then it creates a conversation about what you want from them, what you want them to focus on, how you want them to shift. I want you to really think about tailoring your care, use your voice, talk to them, introduce them to these ideas. And if they are resistant, stay open and inquire into their resistance. And it might seem that it's you that has to do all the work, but sometimes we actually need to sit down and stay curious, because these are the resources that are afforded to us. And if you're on medication, they are the people that are now in control of whether they think you need to be on medication or not. And that's particularly for those people who have been coerced. But if you're not coerced and your family, your parents or your siblings have seen you in distress and it's caused significant distress in the family, they won't be happy with you thinking about coming off medication or with these conversations that we're having here. So invite your family into these conversations, please. This is an important kaupapa for all of us. So ngā mihi kia koutou katoa, we'll go into the new model. I might post up that model before we start tomorrow, if I get time. Kia ora rā.